Olivia and Rachel Sanders had always been inseparable sisters by blood, best friends by choice. But when both women secretly fell into the arms of the same man, Pastor Elijah Moore, the bond between them became a loaded secret. Their husband, Mark Sanders, watched from the shadows, collecting every lie, every betrayal until one quiet Sunday evening, he walked into the sanctuary and made sure their twisted love story ended in blood. In the quiet southern town of Willow Creek, life moved at a slow and predictable pace. Most of its residents had lived there their entire lives, and newcomers were often viewed with cautious curiosity. Among the familiar faces, one man stood apart: Pastor Elijah Moore. At just 38, Elijah had become the heart of the town's spiritual life. With his deep voice, kind smile, and movie star looks, he made people feel seen and heard in a way they hadn't felt before. His sermons were passionate and filled with warmth, and his presence gave the illusion of safety and trust. People called him a gift from God, a man who could heal broken souls with nothing more than his words and prayers. It wasn't long before the Sanders family grew especially close to him. Mark Sanders, a hardworking electrician, was married to Olivia, a quiet and graceful woman known for her devotion to church and family. Olivia's younger sister, Rachel, had recently returned to Willow Creek after a messy divorce. She had nowhere else to go and moved into the Sanders home until she could get back on her feet. At first, the arrangement felt like a blessing. Rachel helped around the house, looked after the kids, and even supported Olivia emotionally. The two sisters had always been close, and their bond appeared unbreakable. Elijah offered counseling to Rachel, knowing she had been through a painful time. Their first session was during a quiet Thursday afternoon in the church office. Rachel confessed how broken she felt, how unloved, how lost. Elijah listened attentively, his voice soft but firm, telling her that healing was possible and that she was stronger than she knew. She left the session smiling for the first time in months. A few days later, Olivia requested a session of her own, something to rekindle the spark in her marriage. Elijah welcomed her too, guiding her gently through the struggles of a decade-long relationship that had grown stale under the weight of routine. Soon, both sisters began visiting the church regularly, not just for Sunday service, but for private sessions and volunteer work. Elijah praised their commitment to the congregation. He often highlighted their efforts during sermons, calling them beacons of faith. The attention pleased them. Olivia felt seen again. Rachel felt wanted. Neither woman suspected the other's connection to the pastor was growing dangerously intimate. Mark, ever busy with work, didn't notice the changes at first. He trusted his wife completely and had always viewed Rachel like a little sister. The idea that something could be amiss never entered his mind. He believed the church was a place of healing and that Elijah was a man of honor. So, when Olivia mentioned she was volunteering late into the evening, or when Rachel claimed she had choir practice, Mark didn't question it. He continued working long hours, sometimes even picking up weekend jobs just to keep everything running smoothly at home. The first cracks began to show during a summer church picnic. Elijah moved through the crowd effortlessly, greeting everyone with charm and ease. Olivia stood by his side much of the afternoon, laughing too freely, standing too close. Later, Rachel arrived in a bright yellow dress that turned heads, especially Elijah's. Mark noticed a subtle tension between the sisters that day, a stiffness he couldn't explain. At one point, he caught Rachel glancing at Elijah with something that looked like longing. The thought disturbed him, but he quickly brushed it aside. Meanwhile, Elijah grew bolder. He began scheduling Olivia's and Rachel's sessions back-to-back. He told each woman what she needed to hear, that she was special, beautiful, chosen. He knew their weaknesses. Olivia wanted to feel needed again. Rachel needed someone to anchor her. Elijah played both roles effortlessly. He never promised anything explicitly, but his actions carried a weight that suggested more than just spiritual guidance. The secrecy of it all fed the fire. Late-night messages under the guise of prayer chains. Private meetings in the dimly lit study. Light touches that lingered too long. Both sisters began to change. Olivia became more confident, radiant even. Rachel's mood swings grew intense. She would be euphoric one day, withdrawn the next. Neither woman confided in the other. They both believed they had something sacred with the pastor. As the weeks passed, the house grew tenser. Olivia and Rachel started bickering over small things: laundry, groceries, childcare. Mark chalked it up to the stress of three adults living under one roof. But he couldn't ignore the feeling that something had shifted. He began staying up later, watching the hallway when the women thought he was asleep. One night, he heard the front door open and close quietly after midnight. He peered out the window and saw Rachel walking down the driveway, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Still, Mark said nothing. His trust ran deep, and the thought of betrayal was too painful to consider. He told himself she was probably taking a walk to clear her head. That same night, Olivia lay awake in bed beside him, eyes open, her thoughts somewhere else entirely. Elijah continued preaching on Sundays with unmatched passion. His sermons took on a new energy. He spoke of temptation, of forgiveness, of secret sins. The congregation was moved, unaware of the irony bleeding through every word. People left the church feeling inspired, never imagining that the man on the pulpit was living a double life just beneath the surface. And then, one ordinary morning, Mark found something strange. Olivia's phone was left on the kitchen counter, unlocked. He wasn't a snooping man, but a strange instinct took over. He opened her messages and saw a thread with a number saved under EA. The messages were brief, cryptic, and yet crystal clear. "Last night was perfect. I can't stop thinking about you. Same time tomorrow?" Mark's hands trembled. He looked up as Olivia walked into the room, still in her robe, coffee in hand. She smiled at him like nothing was wrong. Like she hadn't just shattered the entire world he thought he lived in. He said nothing. Not then. In that moment, the man who had once trusted without question became someone else, entirely someone who needed answers. And he was willing to go to the darkest corners of the truth to find them. Mark couldn't unsee the messages. They replayed in his mind like a broken record, each phrase striking a nerve. He kept imagining Elijah's voice behind those words, calm and charismatic, the same voice that had once blessed his children at the altar. Something inside Mark broke that morning, but he didn't show it. He placed the phone back exactly as he found it and kissed Olivia on the cheek before leaving for work. She smiled again, completely unaware that her secrets were unraveling. That day at the job site, Mark couldn't concentrate. Every sound, every face blurred as his thoughts spiraled. He remembered the nights Olivia came home late, claiming the church needed extra help preparing for a service. He remembered Rachel sneaking in quietly after midnight, shoes in her hands, cheeks flushed. For months, he had dismissed these red flags, too trusting, too blind. Now, everything pointed to one man, Pastor Elijah Moore. When he returned home that evening, dinner was on the table, the kids laughing, the sisters chatting in the kitchen like any other day. Mark sat down and watched them closely. Olivia looked relaxed, her eyes sparkling as she talked about her garden. Rachel, on the other hand, seemed tense. Her eyes darted toward Olivia too often, as if searching for hidden cues or measuring her reactions. The tension between the sisters had evolved into something deeper, more strained. They were hiding something. Mark was now certain it wasn't just from him, but from each other too. Over the next week, he quietly collected more signs. He bought a burner phone and began forwarding texts and call logs from Olivia's device. He installed a small recording device in the hallway, positioned near the front door. He even placed a camera in the garage, where Rachel often took phone calls under the excuse of needing space. What he uncovered made his stomach churn. Elijah wasn't just involved with Olivia. He was also seeing Rachel. The recordings captured snippets of both sisters making plans to meet him always at different times, always in secrecy. Rachel's calls were more emotional, laced with longing and desperation. Olivia's tone was more confident, even possessive. They didn't know about each other. They were both entangled in the same illusion that they were special, chosen by the man they believed to be holy. Mark began connecting the timeline. Elijah had seduced Rachel first, taking advantage of her vulnerability after the divorce. Then he had moved on to Olivia, charming her with sermons about love, faith, and redemption. He made each woman feel like the center of his world while balancing the lie between them. The manipulation was surgical, layered with just enough spiritual jargon to mask the sin. And yet, Elijah's arrogance would be his downfall. He underestimated Mark. He believed the quiet electrician would never suspect anything, let alone gather evidence. He didn't realize that Mark, once pushed to the edge, would become relentless, Mark didn't confront Olivia or Rachel. Instead, he pretended. He played the role of the oblivious husband and protective brother-in-law while documenting every move. He started attending church again, sitting quietly in the back pew, watching Elijah preach about forgiveness and morality. The hypocrisy made his blood boil, but he kept his face neutral, even kind. Elijah greeted him with a firm handshake after service, the same hand that had touched his wife and her sister in secrecy. The more Mark watched, the more he saw how deeply Elijah had infected the community. Women adored him, men respected him. Children idolized him. No one questioned his late-night counseling sessions or his private visits. He had crafted a role so pure that even suspicion felt like blasphemy. But Mark no longer saw a pastor, he saw a predator cloaked in scripture. Then something unexpected happened. Rachel found out she was pregnant. Mark discovered the test hidden in the laundry room, wrapped in a towel and buried beneath a pile of clothes. At first he wasn't sure whose it was, but then Rachel's demeanor changed. She stopped going out, she cried more, her appetite vanished. And when Olivia wasn't looking, Mark noticed her hand resting on her belly, almost protectively. He didn't need confirmation. His gut screamed the truth. Elijah had not only seduced both sisters, but had also left one of them carrying his child. Rachel didn't tell anyone. Not even Olivia. Mark watched as she quietly spiraled, torn between guilt and fear. She stopped attending church but continued texting Elijah, messages filled with panic and need. Elijah's replies grew cold. He told her to stay calm, to trust him, and to keep everything private. Mark printed every message, kept them in a folder labeled simply. Proof? The affair was no longer a secret love triangle. It was a loaded gun waiting to go off. Mark tried to distance himself emotionally, but the betrayal cut too deep. He started having nightmares, visions of Olivia in Elijah's arms, Rachel crying in a hospital bed, Elijah standing at the pulpit with blood on his hands. He woke up drenched in sweat, sometimes in tears, always alone despite Olivia lying beside him. One evening he followed Olivia to the church. She thought he was working late, but he parked a block away and waited in the dark. Around 9 p.m., she entered through the side door. 15 minutes later, Elijah arrived. Mark crept toward the window and saw the light in the pastor's study flick on. Shadows moved behind the blinds. He stayed there for an hour, watching, waiting. When they finally emerged, Olivia was laughing, adjusting her hair. Elijah placed a hand on her back in a way that was too familiar. Mark felt something cold and sharp bloom inside him. It wasn't just jealousy or heartbreak, it was rage, slow-burning and patient, the kind that doesn't shout, the kind that plans. He stopped sleeping altogether, his eyes grew darker. His smiles more forced. Every moment at home became theater. He kissed Olivia on the forehead before work. He made Rachel tea when she was nauseous, but behind those gestures was a man unraveling. Every lie they told him was another brick in the wall he was building in his mind. He went to the lake on weekends, pretending to fish but really just thinking, planning, imagining different scenarios, confrontation, exposure, revenge. Forgiveness never once entered his thoughts. The man who once trusted his wife with everything now trusted only one thing, that something had to give. And when it did, someone wouldn't survive. Mark spent his days moving through a world that no longer felt real. Every smile from Olivia felt rehearsed. Every glance from Rachel looked like a silent plea. The air inside the house was heavy, thick with invisible tension. The quiet moments, once peaceful, were now unbearable. When the television was off and the kids were asleep, the silence screamed louder than words ever could. He no longer saw his wife and sister-in-law. He saw betrayal wrapped in routine. And worse, he saw the man who had caused it all continuing to walk free, hiding behind his sermons and spotless reputation. He had collected all the proof he needed. The text messages, the recordings, the photos. He could have exposed Elijah to the church board. He could have handed the evidence over to the police, to the town elders, to anyone. But that wasn't enough for Mark. Public humiliation would be a wound for Elijah, but it wouldn't be permanent. People forget scandals with time. But Mark didn't want a wound, he wanted an ending. He began watching Elijah more closely, learning his patterns. Tuesday mornings were always spent at the local cafe. Thursdays he met with the church treasurer. Saturday nights he often returned to the church late, claiming prayer or preparation. That was when he met the sisters, Olivia on some nights, Rachel on others, sometimes both, though never at the same time. Mark wondered how Elijah managed the web without it tangling. He assumed the pastor had done this before. Maybe not with sisters, maybe not this recklessly, but the precision of his deceit suggested practice. What Elijah didn't realize was that Mark was no longer a passive observer. He was no longer the wronged husband waiting for an apology that would never come. He was now a man with a plan, and every passing day brought him closer to it. The first step was control. He made sure Olivia believed he was still clueless. He played the part well, slightly distant, but busy, distracted by work. With Rachel he was careful. A few kind words, a few favors. She still believed he saw her as just family. In reality, he was studying her guilt, measuring how much pressure she could take before she cracked. He found the perfect opportunity on a Sunday morning. Elijah gave a sermon titled Taming the Flesh. The irony nearly made Mark laugh out loud. The pastor's words about temptation and virtue were delivered with such confidence, so smooth it was like watching a magician at work. The congregation clapped, moved to tears. Olivia wiped her eyes during the closing prayer. Rachel didn't attend that morning. She had stopped showing up entirely, using headaches and morning sickness as excuses. But Mark noticed her phone lighting up with messages from Elijah throughout the service. Later that day, Mark told Olivia he was going out of town for a work emergency. It was a lie. Instead, he parked near the church again that evening, in the same hidden spot behind the old fire station. At exactly 7:45 p.m., Olivia pulled up in her car, wearing makeup and a long coat despite the warm weather. At 8:03, Elijah arrived in his black SUV. Mark didn't move. He just watched, the anger in him now a cold, calculating thing. He could predict every move, every excuse, every lie. He returned home before Olivia and pretended to be asleep on the couch. When she came in, she tiptoed around the room thinking she hadn't been seen, but Mark saw everything. Every move she made only added fuel to the fire. He had once loved her with a depth that surprised even him. Now that love was buried under layers of disgust, betrayal, and something darker. The next day he bought a gun. It wasn't difficult. The pawnshop owner didn't ask many questions. Mark chose something simple, a .38 revolver, easy to use, hard to trace. He locked it in the toolbox in the garage, buried beneath old wires and sockets. Every night, after the house fell silent, he would open the box and stare at it. Some nights he held it, turning it over in his hand. It gave him a strange sense of calm. He didn't know exactly when he would use it, but he knew why. That reason never wavered. Then came the moment that changed everything. Rachel passed out in the kitchen. Olivia screamed and Mark rushed in. She was unconscious, pale, and cold. The ambulance arrived quickly, and the paramedics carried her out. Mark rode with them while Olivia followed behind in the car. At the hospital, tests were run. Hours passed. Then a nurse entered the waiting room with a clipboard and the words that confirmed what Mark had already suspected: Rachel was pregnant, severely dehydrated, and under extreme emotional stress. Mark thanked the nurse and walked to the hospital bathroom. Inside the stall, he locked the door and sat on the closed toilet lid. He placed his face in his hands and finally cried. Not just from pain, but from clarity. The child inside Rachel's body was not his. It was not a miracle. It was proof. Proof that Elijah had broken something sacred beyond repair. Rachel stayed at the hospital overnight. Olivia never left her side. The sisters clung to each other like survivors of a shipwreck, neither realizing they had both been pulled under by the same current. Mark went home alone. The house was empty, but he no longer needed anyone to confirm the truth. The pieces had all fallen into place. The evidence was no longer just digital or visual. It was living inside the woman who had trusted Elijah the most. The following morning, Mark opened his laptop and began typing. Not an email, not a confession, a letter. In it, he detailed everything: the affairs, the lies, the child, the deception. But he didn't write it for the police or the church. He wrote it for his children, to explain what their father was about to do, to make sense of something that would never truly be understood. He printed the letter and sealed it in an envelope. Then he opened the toolbox and loaded the revolver. Elijah had taken 2 women and turned them against each other, against truth, against God. He had ruined the family, led to a town, and preached virtue with a mouth full of poison. Mark had given him time, had given him chances, had watched as the man mocked faith with every hidden touch and every deceitful word. Now, Mark had nothing left to give except justice, and he would deliver it the only way he knew how. Sunday evening arrived under a sky streaked with soft clouds and fading sunlight. The streets of Willow Creek were mostly quiet, the way they always were before dark. Families sat down for dinner, children finished homework, and porch lights flickered on one by one. But Mark wasn't home. He was in his car, parked 2 blocks from the church, engine off, hands steady. In the passenger seat beside him sat a small duffel bag. Inside was a change of clothes, gloves, and the revolver he had been sleeping next to for a week. He didn't think of it as a weapon. He thought of it as punctuation, a final period to a sentence that had gone on too long. He had spent the afternoon preparing, both physically and mentally. His movements were quiet and methodical, like a man performing a chore he had rehearsed 100 times. There was no fear anymore, no second thoughts. The pain had already burned through him and left nothing behind but resolve. Everything had been taken from him, his marriage, his trust, his sense of peace. All he had now was a truth too ugly to carry and a choice too heavy to ignore. The plan was simple. Elijah was always at the church Sunday nights, locking up, preparing for the week ahead. Olivia had told Mark she would be visiting Rachel at the hospital. Rachel would be asleep, sedated with anti-nausea medication. There would be no interruptions, no witnesses. Only Elijah and the consequences of his sins. Mark checked his watch. 7:56 p.m. Across the street, the church lights flickered on. A familiar SUV pulled into the side lot and Elijah stepped out, dressed in black slacks and a pressed shirt, Bible tucked under one arm. Mark watched as he unlocked the side door and disappeared inside. He waited 5 more minutes. Then he opened the car door, slung the duffel over his shoulder, and walked across the empty street. The church felt colder than usual. The air was thick and still. Mark moved down the back hallway, past the Sunday school rooms and the old coat closet. He knew the layout well. They had been married in this very building. His children had been baptized here. Now he walked its halls like a ghost with unfinished business. From behind the door of Elijah's study, Mark could hear movement, papers rustling, footsteps, a chair scraping. Then, laughter low and familiar. Mark froze. There was another voice. A woman's, Olivia. His mind scrambled. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was supposed to be at the hospital. The plan was built on that. Mark pressed his ear closer. The voices were muffled but close. His pulse quickened. He turned and backed into the adjacent hallway, waiting in the shadows. 2 minutes passed. The door creaked open. Footsteps moved toward the sanctuary, the echo of heels and dress shoes on polished floors. Mark followed at a distance, slow and silent, staying behind columns and corners. He saw them clearly now, Elijah and Olivia walking side by side, her hand brushing his arm as they spoke. The sanctuary was dim, lit only by the soft glow of candles near the altar. They sat down in the front pew, still unaware of his presence. Elijah leaned in close to her, smiling, whispering something that made her laugh. It was the kind of moment Mark used to share with her before the lies. Before the sickness spread through their home, he stepped forward. His foot scraped the marble floor. Elijah turned first. His smile froze. Olivia gasped, instinctively reaching for her purse. Mark stopped 10 feet from them, arms relaxed, eyes steady. For a moment no one moved. The air inside the sanctuary dropped a few degrees. Elijah stood slowly, a practiced calm in his voice as he said something Mark couldn't hear. Mark didn't respond. Instead, he unzipped the duffel bag and pulled out the revolver. Olivia stepped back, her hands rising as if to block what was coming. Her mouth moved, frantic and soundless. Elijah's calm melted away. He took a single step forward, hand outstretched, but stopped when he saw the gun rise to chest level. Mark didn't yell, he didn't explain. The time for words had long passed. The shot rang out like thunder inside the sanctuary. It echoed off the walls, sharp and final. Elijah dropped to the ground, a dark stain blooming across his shirt. Olivia screamed, falling to her knees beside him. Mark stood still, watching as the man who had torn his family apart gasped and twitched in silence. There was no struggle. No dramatic last words. Only the sound of Olivia sobbing and the faint creak of the church doors as the wind pushed them open. Mark turned and walked away. The gun slipped from his hand near the altar steps. He didn't need it anymore. He exited through the rear door, stepped into the night, and vanished into the darkness before anyone else arrived. Police swarmed the scene 20 minutes later after Olivia called 911 in hysterics. She tried to explain, but her words tumbled over each other, broken by shock and horror. The officers found the revolver where it had been dropped and followed a trail of footprints through the grass behind the church, but Mark was already gone. For hours, law enforcement searched the neighborhood. Roadblocks were set up. A BOLO alert went out statewide. Helicopters hovered above Willow Creek, but there was no sign of him. At the hospital, Rachel was sedated again after being told what had happened. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. Her body curled into itself as if trying to disappear. No one told her that the father of her unborn child had died at the hands of her sister's husband. She already knew. Olivia refused to leave the police station. She answered every question, described every detail, replayed every second. But even after the statements were filed and the lights in the interrogation room went dark, she sat there in silence, her life shattered beyond recognition. The news spread quickly. By morning, Elijah's death was the headline on every local channel. The town was in shock. Some refused to believe it. Others whispered that it made sense, that a secret had been hiding beneath that polished image all along. In the eyes of the public, Elijah Moore had died a tragic victim. It would be days before the truth behind the affair leaked out, and even then, many chose not to believe it. The church never reopened, the pews stayed empty, the candles burned out, and the sanctuary, once filled with song and prayer, now echoed only with the memory of a gunshot. The town of Willow Creek woke up the next morning to something it had never faced before: scandal soaked in blood. Word of Pastor Elijah Moore's murder traveled fast, faster than the wind that rustled through the trees lining Main Street. For years, Elijah had been the man everyone turned to for guidance. He baptized babies, married couples, counseled the troubled, and buried the dead. Now he had been buried in sin and death. The first reports framed the story as a shocking act of jealousy. Local media described it as a love triangle gone wrong, with Mark Sanders, a respected electrician and father of two, gunning down the town's beloved pastor in cold blood. At first, the public recoiled in disbelief. But as details emerged, disbelief gave way to whispers, and whispers turned into suspicion. It began with the leak of the affair. Someone inside the police department anonymously confirmed that Pastor Elijah had been having an affair with Olivia Sanders. By noon, the news had spread. The respectable image of Elijah began to erode. People asked why Olivia had been at the church that late. Why had Rachel Sanders stopped attending services? Why had Elijah spent so much time alone with both women? Then came the bigger shock. Rachel's pregnancy became part of the investigation. Medical records obtained during questioning revealed she was carrying Elijah's child. The timeline aligned with months of late-night visits and private counseling sessions. Both sisters had been involved with the same man at the same time, and their connection to him had gone far beyond prayer. What had once looked like an unthinkable act by a jealous husband now resembled something far more disturbing: a long manipulation of an entire family by the one man they trusted most. Detectives retrieved Mark's letter during a search of his home. It was found in a sealed envelope, hidden inside his workshop drawer. The letter was addressed to his children. In it, Mark wrote with heartbreaking clarity. He described the discovery of the affairs, the betrayal he had quietly endured, the pain of watching his family break apart in silence. He spoke about the sickness Elijah had brought into their home, how he played Olivia and Rachel against each other while smiling in their faces. The letter wasn't an excuse. It was a confession not of guilt, but of grief. In his words, Mark never tried to justify what he did. He simply explained what it felt like to lose everything while the person responsible stood in a pulpit pretending to heal others. The final line read, There are some sins no sermon can clean. After reading it, the lead detective said nothing for a long time. He folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope, realizing that whatever people thought of Mark, the truth was not so black and white. The manhunt for Mark continued for 3 more days. His car was found abandoned near the edge of Silver Pine Forest, 20 miles outside town. A trail of footprints led from the roadside into the woods, then vanished. Drones searched from above. Search dogs combed the trails. Locals volunteered with flashlights and walkie-talkies, but no one could find him. On the 4th day, a hiker discovered a body near the base of a ravine. It was Mark. The gun was nearby, along with another envelope, this one addressed to no one. The coroner ruled it a suicide. His death, like the one he had delivered, was quiet and deliberate. Just like everything else he had done after learning the truth, the town changed after that. The church where Elijah once preached never reopened. The windows stayed boarded up. Weeds crept across the parking lot. No new pastor was named, no service was held. Some residents tried to start a petition to restore the church, but most didn't sign. It had become a symbol of something that couldn't be prayed away. Olivia and Rachel disappeared from public life. Olivia moved out of Willow Creek within weeks, taking the children and what little remained of her dignity. She left no forwarding address. Friends said she refused to speak about Elijah or Mark, even to family. The betrayal she experienced toward herself, her husband, her sister had left scars that words couldn't reach. Rachel stayed behind a little longer, staying with a friend on the outskirts of town. Her pregnancy advanced in near isolation. She rarely left the house. When asked about the baby, she said nothing. It was unclear whether she would keep the child, give it up, or move away. Some people sympathized with her, blaming Elijah for taking advantage of her when she was most vulnerable. Others whispered crueler things, saying she destroyed her sister's marriage and brought ruin to a good man. The truth sat somewhere in the silence between those judgments. The community itself was fractured. People who had once sat together in pews now crossed the street to avoid each other. Some chose to believe Elijah had made a mistake but didn't deserve to die. Others believed he was a fraud whose sins had finally caught up with him. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing: nothing would ever be the same again. In time, a few tried to move on. The bakery reopened. The kids went back to school. New families moved into homes with no knowledge of what had happened. But for those who lived through it, the tragedy stayed with them. It wasn't just about a murder or a scandal. It was about trust, how easily it can be broken, how deeply it can wound. Years later, people still avoided talking about it directly. They referred to it vaguely as what happened at the church or the Sanders mess. The story remained like a scar under a sleeve, always there, even if no one pointed to it. Elijah Moore, the pastor who once preached about redemption, was buried in the church cemetery without a public service. A simple stone marked his grave. No mention of his title, just a name and 2 dates. Mark Sanders was cremated. His children, too young to understand at the time, would one day read the letter he left for them. And perhaps then they would see their father not as a monster or a martyr, but as a man who had broken under the weight of betrayal no heart should bear. And the child Elijah's last secret was born one rainy night at a county hospital. Whether that child would ever know the full truth remained uncertain. Some believed the past should be buried. Others feared that what had been buried could someday rise again. What started as desire ended in disaster, a family destroyed, a pastor dead, a town forever changed. And in the center of it all, a single decision that made sure the story wouldn't end in silence, but in blood.